Welcome back to our Learn to Code using Roblox series. We've only got a couple more beginner topics before I start covering some more advanced stuff, and today we're going to cover events, so remote events, bindable events, but also remote functions and bindable functions. So stay tuned. We really can't talk about events without first discussing the Roblox client-server model. So the server is responsible for keeping every client in sync with itself, right? Anything that's running on the server is running for every connected client. In other words, it's replicated to each player's system so that each player should see the same thing. Now, each client runs a copy of your game with the server updating any replicated information to it at runtime. Runtime being when the game is running. So the difference is that there are client-only things such as GUI elements that only exist per individual client. Not only does the server not have access to your user interface, other clients also do not have access to it. Instead, they have their own version running on their own system. So events in general are always happening, right? Roblox is an event-driven system. There's a ton of built-in events that automatically fire, such as when a player's character touches a part, when a player joins or leaves the game, or even when an object is created or destroyed at runtime. In order to utilize an event, we want to listen for the event to fire and then connect a function that executes when it does. Okay? So when talking about custom events, there are three communication types we can use that occur across the client-server boundary. So there's client to server, there's server to client, and then there's server to all clients. So these are the remote events and remote functions. Right, remote being the key word there. It's also possible to communicate on the same side of the client-server boundary by using bindable events and bindable functions. These four objects at their core are essentially just communication devices to communicate between different scripts. So not to be confused with how module scripts can be accessed from other scripts. We'll be covering module scripts in depth in the next episode, so make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notify bell to be alerted when that goes live. That is going to be a big one. Module scripts kind of make up the core experience, I would say, for developing games, or the scripting side anyways. So with remote events, this communication, right, is only one way. One of our script is broadcasting the message to any number of scripts on the other side of the server client boundary. Those scripts just have to be listening for the event to trigger. So bindable events, on the other hand, handle communication between scripts that exist on the same side of the server client boundary. For example, from a server-sided script to another server-side script, or from a local script to another local script. It acts exactly the same. It's one-way communication, and one script is broadcasting the data, and any number of other scripts on the same side of that server client boundary are listening for the event. We'll talk about remote and bindable functions in just a bit, but let's go ahead and break down how these custom events work first. You may be familiar with some of Roblox's built-in events using our object browser in the game here now. I do have mine a little collapsed here, but it's going to be the object browser in your view tab. You can see that whenever we have anything selected in here, you're going to find these lightning bolts. So these are built-in events for the selected object. So we can see further, of course, that these are all members of whatever they're part of. So let's do the changed here, right? This is a member of object, which is exactly what we have selected. So whichever instance it is a part of determines how we access them, and they should all show exactly how the event fires off as well. So going back and selecting the part here, coming down, we can go to our touched event. This is a very commonly used event here. Under the summary section, it tells us what triggers this event to fire. It says fires when a part touches another part as a result of physical movement. So it's pretty straightforward. If a moving part touches another part, or touches this part. So we still have a part from our previous video in our workspace here. So let's create a script that simply prints a message showing what part of our character is touching the part in the workspace when they make contact. So we first need to go ahead and create a script. We'll go ahead and do that in here. And we'll leave it as script for now, it doesn't really matter. So we need to get a reference to our part. First, we'll go ahead and do local, I'm gonna call it part, and this is gonna be workspace dot, we have this in the part folder, I believe, yes. And then dot part. We didn't name it, but that's fine. So now that we have access to the part, we can not only access the properties of the part, right? So part.transparency, for example, that's one of its properties. But we can also, you can see here, these icons line up kind of with the object browser. You can see the lightning bolt here. You have the touched event, right? So we can go ahead and select that. You can see it is an RBX script signal, and it fires just as it says here when a part touches it. So we'll go ahead and enter that. So while we can access it like this, it doesn't do any good as is, right? We need to connect something to happen when the touched event is triggered. Essentially, the game is firing a signal whenever the touched event happens, and this is our way to connect to it. So we do this using the built-in connect functions. We're going to use a colon here, and you can see as we start to type it, it says connects the given function to the event and returns an RBX script connection that represents it. That being a Roblox script connection, which is a data type simply called a connection. It's somewhat inconsequential, but if you have a lot of these in memory and you're wanting to be very memory conscious, you can actually save this connection to a variable and then use the disconnect function on it, right? So if we went ahead and did local connection equals this, right? Then later on down the road, we can say connection and disconnect. And that would disconnect that for us. So when and why you would use that, we'll discuss that in a more advanced lesson. So the connect function takes an argument of a function, meaning that you have to have a function inside of this. And you can see it's looking for a function there. If you missed my video on functions where we also covered parameters and arguments, check that out in this same playlist. We'll just create an anonymous function to create the touching part. An anonymous function means we don't need a named function defined beforehand. You'll notice though, as I'm typing here, we're able to see what the expected value is going to be in the connect function itself. This will differ depending on the event, of course, but touched is passing us a value called other part, which is itself expecting here anyways a base part. Technically it's an instance, so it could be anything, but it is going to be a base part that's getting passed through, which is either a part or a mesh part. A mesh part is something you would import, you know, from Blender, for example, that actually has a different look to it other than any of the normal Roblox parts. So that other part is the one that's touching the part that we're referencing here to trigger this event, and it's exactly what we want to print out. So if you want, you can view what data is going to be given for an event in the object browser or the documentation, right? So we can select the anonymous autofill if we want, and the nice part about that is it will automatically put our other part and base part in there. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it tries to keep everything on the same line, but this is a good way to point out this is going to be kind of weird to write. It's going to look a little strange, but keep in mind that all of this is within the parentheses of the connect function, right? So ideally, when we get here, we want to hit enter and actually have some space here so we can actually write what we want. And in this case, while our formatting obviously looks a little out here, we're just going to go ahead and get the name of our other part, right? So we're going to go ahead and print, and we're going to access that other part's property of name. So it's pretty common to use something like this if you really never need to use this function itself more than just in this one place, right? So it's kind of following the dry principle, the DRY, don't repeat yourself. Or if the function is sufficiently simple enough to be easy to understand what it's doing without breaking it off into its own function. But we could definitely create a function, right? I can say local function, and we can call this onTouch. And we're still going to need the other part as a, again, you can name this whatever you want, but this would be our parameter, the other part. And then in here, we do basically the same thing. We just print other part.name. Obviously, it didn't pull up any sort of autocomplete doing it this way, and that's because it doesn't know that it's a base part. You can easily use the colon and basically use a type hint to force that. That will also be in a slightly more advanced topic in a video coming up at some point. But now what we can do is we can either call our onTouch event here and fill in the other part, right? But because we're getting the other part from the touch event and we're using just the other part here, we really don't even need to have this anonymous function. Now we have a named function that's doing it, and you can just fill it in like that. The only difference would be if, for example, we needed, I don't know, an other thing, right, passed in here. Our touched event is only passing the one argument. So we would actually have to do the function here. And then we would call our onTouched event with the other part, and then the other thing, right? Whatever other arguments you want to put in there. So that's how that would work. But like I said, we don't really need to do that because we have a function to do this now. All right, so if we go ahead and run the game, you can ignore that. I don't know why that came up. We are basically able to see, first of all, it's touching the base plate, right? The base plate is touching our part. So that fired off and that went in there. We can also go over here and we can touch it, and you can see that it is going to print out the different parts that have been touching it. Right foot, left foot, humanoid root part even touched it for a second there, right? We kicked it, so it's fired off the base plate again, right? Because it has to be a moving thing. Initially, when you set things up, some settling happens because it's not anchored, so that's why it considered movement with the base plate there. Obviously, if you don't want it to recognize a base plate in that case, you would want to check if the other part is a character. We'll go over that here in a little bit as well. So the event's sending the other part as a Roblox script signal. We're listening for the event to fire using the connect function, and we're creating this Roblox script connection, right? So before moving on, I want to point out that connect is not the only method that we can use on an event. For example, if we only want to do something once, right, only a single time when the event is triggered and not again after that, we can instead use the once function. All right, so this behavior is similar to connect. However, instead of allowing multiple events to be received by the connected function, like we were seeing all the different parts being touched here, only the first event will be delivered. Between the event firing and the function actually being called, the connection we made is automatically disconnected. Like I mentioned how you can use the disconnect function earlier. Yet another useful option is using the wait function. And this will simply halt the script we're running this on until the event fires. Then it actually returns the arguments provided by the event itself, such as the other part in the touched event. If we wanted to access the arguments from the event, we would actually want to store that in a variable. So we'll do like other part spell local correctly, it really helps. And then of course we can call our on touch here and fill in other part. And this is essentially the same way as we had before. It's just waiting for that to happen. There's different reasons you might use things this way. Obviously, this is a weird example of doing that, but I do challenge you to kind of figure that out. Also, there is one more of these called Connect Parallel, which you'll see if I this Connect Parallel here. It deals with scripts connecting in parallel and being in a desynchronized state, which are all much more advanced than what this video is going to cover. I challenge you to look over the documentation, discover its usage on your own, though it's possible I may eventually release a video with it explained. But alright, let's go back to how we had things before with our connect. There we are. Now we know pretty much all there is to need to know about built-in events from Roblox, right? It's pretty much handled the same way for most of them. Obviously, each scenario is going to have its own usage case. I highly suggest checking out what events are available for each object you might consider using in your game and thinking of interesting ways you might use them. So turning our attention back to remote events then, these are just custom events that we get to create and define entirely ourselves. We determine what thing happening causes it to fire, and then we can treat it exactly as we did with our touched event and listen for it to fire, calling a function to be performed once the signal is received, for example. We can determine what information is sent through the event signal as well. Let's do something simple using our touched event as the trigger to give us an easy to demonstrate scenario. So we first need to create the event instance. More often than not, events are going to exist in replicated storage. This is since they tend to handle communication to and from both the server and the client, and replicated storage is accessible to both of them. An argument could be made that if you're only using an event for server to server or client to client communication, use it on Bindable event, for example, which we'll cover. You could place the event itself in a location only accessible to those, but it's often much more convenient to have all of your events in a single place. As such, I am going to create a folder, and we are going to call this events. You'll see a lot of people will call them remotes and whatnot. Personally, I think event is more apt because you can store your bindable events here in Bindable Functions, and remote functions, Bindable Functions, remote events, Bindable events, they're all technically events. They're signals, right? You could call it signals, I suppose. And then let's go ahead and add a remote event now. You can see it pops up here. And we're going to rename this to onTouch, similar to our function. So as I said near the beginning of the video, remote events are used to handle communication across the server-client boundary. So this is going to send data from either the server to be received by the client or from the client to the server. In our case, we already have a lot of work done in our server script, so let's rename that real quick and make some minor adjustments. So we'll go ahead and call this event test server. We're doing this so we can see where things are going to come from here. In fact, I will change this to show the context, and we can see where whether it's server or client. Of course, green is going to be server, blue is going to be client if you're looking at colors here, but that's all fine. We'll clear this out as well. All right, so above us getting a reference to our parts, we're going to go ahead and grab a reference to our replicated storage service. We'll go and do replicated storage. You should always have your services listed at the top of your script. Now, there's more on that can be found in an upcoming video covering the Roblox style guide. This course can be game, get service, game correctly, service. We'll get a little auto completion here, and we'll do replicated storage. And now we can get a reference to our actual remote event as well. So we'll do local, and we're going to call it our onTouch event, and we'll set this to replicated storage dot events dot on touch. And now we can do a little change of our touched event connection to actually send this data to the client. So instead of directly printing it here, similar to calling the connect function, we're going to be calling what's called fire client, right, on the event itself. So we're going to do on touch event, right, getting our event there. And then just like the connect uses a colon because we were calling it on the touched event, we're using a colon here, and we're going to do fire client just like that. And we're going to send through the other parts, right? However, you'll notice that the first argument of fire client actually needs to be the player, right? And then you can send any others here. And the reason for that is that our server side event here has no idea which client, right, which player to send this information to. So we need to go ahead and get our player first. So to do that, easy way to do this is to look at our character player structure. We can do that by playing the game, as a matter of fact. Again, we'll ignore this. Pretty sure it's a plugin I was working on. Anyway, so we'll go ahead and go into the workspace, and you can see our character here. And you can see in our character, there's a bunch of different parts. These are all the different parts that would obviously touch our part out here, right? And you see we're getting an error as well. So we need to get the parent of these parts, which would be our character model. And then there's a little trick we can use to get the player from our character model. So we'll go ahead and stop here. So each of those parts on our character is going to be the other part that gets passed through the event, the touch event, right? So we just need to get the parent of the other part to get the character. So we'll go ahead and do local character, and we will set that equal to other part dot parent. And now, in order to get the player, we actually have to use a trick, as I mentioned, involving the player's service. So let's reference that at the top of our script as well. And again, according to the Roblox style guide, having these services in alphabetical order is the ideal way to do this. Although that is not 100% necessary, I do recommend following that. All right, so now back in our function, we have our player's service. We can go ahead and get a reference to our player by doing character, and we're going to use a colon here. Sorry, players, we need to call it on our player's service. Use a colon here, and we're going to get player from character, which is the function that that's going to use, and we'll just fill in our character. Now, there are a number of checks we should technically be performing to ensure things go smoothly, such as making sure the character is a character by checking for a humanoid child, for example. But this will work well enough for our simple example. And now we can pass in our player as the first argument of our fire client function. So that's it for our server's script. Just like anytime a part is touched in a Roblox game technically fires the touched event, unless there's a connection actually listening for the event to fire, it doesn't really do anything, right? It's just sending the signal. So let's make a local script in our starter player scripts here. And I'm going to call this event test listener. We'll call it event test client to be more specific about which one it is here. And in this script, we also need to give reference to our replicated storage and on our event, so I can actually copy those. Although I do not normally recommend copy and pasting as you're learning to code. Type everything out, get really used to doing that. Coding is a lot of typing, so getting better at it is good. All right, so now we can do it exactly like we did with the touched event sample earlier. But this time, despite the client having no direct reference to the part or a connection to the part's touched event, we're getting our information about what part of our character is making contact from a custom event we've set up. So here now, since the event is firing from the server, right, we'll do our on touch event, we're going to be getting from the fire client function. We need to listen for the event using .on client event, right? So this acts the same as when we call .touched on our part, as it's going to be the signal itself. So now we need to use the connect function, right? Notice we do not need to put the player argument that we pass because it's essentially ignored here. Its only purpose was to be used as an address of source to know where to send the signal. So in here, we're going to go ahead and do an anonymous function. There's no arguments to be filled in there, so we're just going to do this. And I'm just going to go ahead and print. Well, actually, it is passing in something. I'm also doing this incorrectly anyways. Here we are. So we are passing in, of course, the other part, which we know is a base part, but that's unimportant for now. Now we can do the same thing we were doing here, other part dot name. And now when we run this, this is still giving us an issue here. We have the player. That should be correct. As I mentioned, because it's touching the base plate first, this is where you want to make sure that you're actually getting those checks in there, right? So in this case, I can actually wrap this in a conditional statement. We'll say if character find first child, which is a humanoid, right? Making sure that it is a character. Then these and give us an end here so that that's all contained in that. And now the base plate obviously will not be, well, the base plate's parent is going to be the workspace. Workspace obviously is not a character and you can't find a player from it. So in this case now it should not give us an issue. It doesn't because base plate's not a character. But we can now see when we touch this that the client is actually printing the parts, right? And it's coming from our event test client. Tried to shortcut things, that's what happened. All right, so the server can also send an event signal to all clients, blasting the signal out to any player actively in the game at the time it fires off. So to do that, you would actually do fire all clients instead of client. And because you don't need to know a specific client or a specific player that you're sending it to, you would actually just go ahead and pass in whatever arguments you're going to pass in. It doesn't need the player argument in that case. So if we wanted to swap this around so that the client was sending the signal to the server, we would actually do exactly as we did here, except on the server side script, we would call the client code. So we would basically go ahead and do our on touch event, and you would see instead there's a .on server event, right? And then in our client side here, if we were to try to do this and send a signal here, right, we use our colon, and you would do fire server, right? So you're firing it to the server. Now, just like the fire all clients, you don't need any additional address or anything when doing fire server. There's only the one server, so you don't have to add like a player into here or anything like that. Okay, so moving on, let's take a brief look at bindable events now. So a bindable event is going to do exactly the same thing as a remote event, except on the same side of the server client boundary. In other words, if we let's go ahead and disable our client script here. We'll focus on our server side here. If we want to go ahead and duplicate our server script in this case, and we're actually going to change the code to be essentially what's in our local script, we can manipulate this to work with a bindable event pretty easily. So let's go ahead and create the bindable event in our events folder. We're going to type in bindable. You'll see there's bindable event and function. Cover the function here in just a second. This comes up as event. We're going to go ahead and call this bindable on touch, just kind of keeping things similar to each other. And then in both of our server scripts now, we need to change this to the bindable on touch reference. And now, rather than the fire client or fire all client, we are actually simply going to use the event or the function fire. So we'll ignore the fact that we're getting the player here, because that obviously doesn't matter in this case, but we'll use that here in a little bit anyways. And then inside of the listening script, in fact, let's go ahead and rename these. Call this event test, or event test. Let's do this caller, and we'll call this listener. Right. So now in our listener script, rather than .on server event or .on client event, this is simply going to be .event to listen for the bindable event. This is going to be exactly the same if we were doing this in two local scripts as well. Bindable events work identically whether they're sending and or receiving on the server or the client. You'll see exactly that this works when we play here. Get rid of this. And you can see it's printing there from the listener script, right? I guess as one benefit, we're not getting the base plate popping up here because we're ignoring if it's not the base plate. So that works. All right, so we're almost done. Hang in there. All right, so the last thing we're going to cover are remote functions and bindable functions. As their names may give away, they work very similar to remote events and bindable events as far as their communication is concerned. Remote events are going to send basically between client and server, which we have displayed here. Bindable is going to send either from server to server or client to client. The only difference is that while remote or bindable events are only going to send a signal one way, a remote or bindable function will actually send information and then wait for information to be returned to it, therefore giving two-way communication between scripts. You can see here, this is going from client to server. It's waiting for a response, then the server sends back to the client. And here's the other way around, from server to the client, and then it's waiting for a response till the client sends it back to the server. So because there is a wait there, you do want to use these cautiously. You want to make sure that your code is perhaps timing out if you're not receiving a response in time. Otherwise, you can get some memory leaks with these things just kind of sitting here and waiting to actually get anything back. All right, so back into Roblox here. Since we have things set up for the bindable event right now, we'll do a bindable function first. So I'm going to go ahead and create a bindable function. Always hit tab, unfortunately. And we will call this bind on touch function. We might as well go ahead and create the other one right now as well. Remote function, since we're in here, and then we can just reference them. And we will call this remote on touch function. That works. All right, so for our bindable function, remote function, to work here, we're going to need to make references to them, right? So we'll start with our bindable function, as I mentioned. So we're going to go ahead and, since we're still doing the server here, we'll go ahead and do bind on touch function, and we'll do it on the listener as well. Bind on touch function, there we go. And we'll simplify our touch event a little more, and we'll simply send a string to the other script. So what we're going to do, we'll leave the on touch function, I suppose. In fact, we'll just go ahead and comment it out. Why not? So instead, on our touch here, we'll go ahead and do our anonymous function. And here we are going to do our on touch event, right? Get a reference to our bind on function, our bind on touch function here. And rather than firing, instead we're going to use a function called invoke. Right, and you see it invokes the bindable function, which in turn calls the on invoked callback, returning any values returned by the callback. So what do we want to send to the listener is what we want to put in here. And in this case, we'll just send a string called sent. Of course, since we're going to be waiting for a value to be returned to us, we should create a variable and store that value in it. So instead here, we're going to do local returned value, and we are going to assign it the return value of the invoke function, right, which will actually come from the other script. And then we're going to go ahead and from here as well, we'll print that value, right? So we'll go ahead and print the returned value, and that's going to be our new touch function there. Now let's jump over to our listener script and set that up. So we've already got, of course, our bind on touch function. And we are going to do things a little differently. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to go ahead and make a small function. We're going to call it on invoke. And we'll call it when we receive the invoke function, right? So in here, we're going to have a received value, which could be anything, of course. And then we'll start by simply printing that received value. Then we're going to return a string that says receive. I can type. There we are. And remember, this is what's going to be then printed on the other script or from the other script. So now we need to go ahead and connect that. So this is where things get a little different. Right, we'll still call our on-touched event here. Rather than making a normal connection to an event, we basically are still going to use our dot on invoke, right? But we're really just assigning our function to it. So in this case, we're going to type on invoke, which is our function that we made here. Because we're not calling the function, we don't want to use the parentheses. If we use the parentheses, it's going to call the function right here as well, and we're just going to get the received, but it's not going to work the way that you want it to. So now, if we play the game, you can see that the listener has sent was print, the caller has received was print, right? Because they're printing back and forth, and it's going to do that every time we touch it. So both scripts are doing exactly as we asked. The only difference if using a remote function is going to depend if the server is invoking the client or if the client is invoking the server. So let's say it's the server first. So we'll go ahead and disable this script. And we'll go ahead and copy this into here. And instead, of course, we're going to do our remote on touch function. And we'll do that here as well. So here now, instead of just using the word invoke, we actually need to use the word invoke client, right? So notice that this still needs a player instance, right, to know exactly which player we are sending this to. So in that case, I'm gonna actually go ahead and uncomment this, and we're going to go ahead and place these in here, and we'll just call our onTouch function again. There we are. And that way it's going to still perform the check to make sure that we are getting our player, and then we can send our player as our first argument in here. So we're not getting an error. And we know exactly which player we are sending the word sent to. And then simply on the client side, we can go ahead and enable this. Rather than it being on invoke, this is going to be on client invoke, right? Callback for when the remote function is invoked with invoke client. And then it should work exactly the same. There we go. You can see the server is printing received because it's receiving that from the client, and the client's printing sent because it's receiving that from the server. All right, and you can see pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it. And in case you couldn't guess, if you wanted to switch this around so that the client is sending to the server, you would actually use touch event. You would use the colon, and then invoke server, and then of course on here on the server side, you would do on touch event the dot on server invoke, and then you would set that to whatever value it is, right? Like a function, for example. But remember, you don't want to actually call the function, you just want to have whatever return value from the function, which this one doesn't have. So that would actually return nil, which is perfectly fine though. All right, so that's a ton of information. It covers a lot of what remote and bindable events and remote and bindable functions are, but not necessarily some of their common or best uses. Instead, we've continued to lay the foundations for our most advanced series, or our more advanced series coming up, and we are going to combine everything. We're going to go over and create something playable and usable so you can actually see some real examples of where all of this really matters, right? So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. If so, please make sure to subscribe, hit the like button. Feel free to leave a comment below as well. I'll be trying to catch back up on releasing videos, but I also have a new baby coming in about a week as of this recording, so no promises can be made, but hit the notify bell to be informed of when those next videos do go live. With that said, I'll see you in the next one.